There's a saying, though, that if you think about Friday on Monday, you're going to quit, right? Because this idea that you're trying to eat the whole elephant, right? You're not able to effectively focus on very small chunks. A buddy of mine likes to say, time is the currency of leadership, and it's true, because time is, everybody has the same. It's an equal commodity. No one has more time than any other person, right? And once you spend it, it's gone. And so when you choose to spend time with another human being, especially those in your span of care, in a business or a team, that shows them that you care about them. That shows them that you care about them in a way that's fairly quantifiable. We learn things about ourselves that we didn't know before because we were thrown into an uncertain environment.
That's incredible. What a great time to bring this book out, huh?
Again, fear starts in the brain. It's our perception of an environment.
Welcome to the Circuit of Success. I'm your host, Brett Gilliland, co-founder and CEO of Visionary Wealth Advisors. And today I've got Rich Diviney on the phone or on the podcast. How you doing?
Good. Thanks, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have you. You are a former Navy SEAL. We always love talking to former Navy SEAls. And you also are the author, like see that little red book right back there, right?
Yeah.
Of attributes.
Yeah.
So that's things going well, it looks like.
So far, so good. The book game, this is my first book, and what I'm told is the book game is a long game. So I'm just playing the long game. So that's fine with me. So
it's kind of like life, isn't it? Kind of a long game, isn't it?
It is. I think if we approach it that way, we're better off, right?
That's right. Well, we'll dive into the book. We'll dive into some Navy SEAL stuff, just the mental side of training. I'm always fascinated by that, and so are our listeners. But really, what we always like to start with, Rich, is what's made you the man you are today? I know that's a really big, open-ended question, but obviously you don't just wake up and become a SEAL. So maybe give us the backstory. Who is Rich, and what's made you the man you are today?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up in Connecticut and one of three other siblings. One of my siblings is an identical twin brother. Oh. And, my dad was a private pilot. And so we used to go flying with him when we were kids all the time, like on the weekends. And, so the love of flying we caught early, especially my twin brother and I. And I think from the age of 7 or 8 years old, we wanted to be Navy pilots. And really, we wanted to be military jet pilots, but we figured the Navy guys landed on ships, and there was probably nothing harder than landing on a ship. So,
right.
So we focused on that. And of course, that was before Top Gun came out. So Top Gun came out after that, and we were of course sold even
more so.
Yeah, even more sold. So the plan was to join the Navy, and it was really right after the first Gulf War I think I was a senior in high school, junior or senior high school. And I saw an article in Newsweek come out and it was called Secret Warriors, about all the special operations forces that are in the military, but also took part, at least in small degree, in the war. So they talked about CCTs and PJs. They talked about Green Berets. They talked about Rangers, and of course the Navy SEALs and Marine Recon. And I noticed in that article it was peppered, the 5 or 6 pages were peppered with different pictures of Spec Ops guys in different environments. So you had guys in the snow, in the desert, in the jungle, underwater. And what I noticed about the 20 or so pictures was that about 17 or 18 of them, something like that, the vast majority of them were Navy SEALs. And the Navy SEALs were like everywhere. They were Navy SEALs in the snow, Navy SEALs in the jungle, Navy SEAls underwater. And I said to myself, man, these guys do everything. That's pretty cool. And so I started researching them and kind of reading as much as I could, and ultimately went to college, ended up at Purdue University and in the ROTC, in the ROTC program. And then kind of said to myself, I never wanted to be in the cockpit of my jet and look over at a SEAL platoon or some SEAL guys and wonder if I could do it. So I just said, I'm going to try this out. And so I applied, I got selected, and found myself at SEAL training in 96. And the rest is history. I mean, obviously 96, my career was from 96 till 2017, and that was obviously a very kinetic period for the military holistically. So most of us really feel actually quite lucky because we got to serve, and we also got to do the job that we came in to do. Which is actually uncommon. It's rare. It should be uncommon, by the way. War is not a good thing for anybody. So I certainly don't want to promote that piece of it. But I was grateful and retired in late December 2016, and since then have been working in the leadership space with started with a company that's kind of close to you, Chapman Co from Barry Wehmiller. They're a leadership institute. Started with them. Worked with my buddy Simon Sinek, Start With Why fame, and then really have been exploring this kind of side of this human behavior, human performance, aspect, which I've been passionate about since day one. So that's really the impetus of the book. So, and here we are today.
That's awesome. Well, thank
Yeah.
you for that story. That's I like that. That's lots to learn. So, what do you think you learned the most about you during Hell Week?
Well, probably without sounding repetitious, is kind of these attributes. What was inside me that I didn't know was inside me? I mean, Hell Week. Well, so BUDS, basic underwater demolition / SEAL training, is 6 months long, right? Hell Week is only the 5th week of the course. So all of BUDS is a challenge. It's usually a really hard. The hardest parts are up front at the beginning. Then Hell Week is kind of the crucible, and then post Hell Week, it's still tough and it still sucks, but they're starting to train you a little bit more. But the thing I loved about BUDS the most was the purity of the process. When you go to something like SEAL training, it didn't matter where you came from. It didn't matter whether you were the all-star sports person or the kid from the farm. It didn't matter if you were the valedictorian of your class or someone who just graduated high school. None of that mattered. The process stripped you down to zero, and really in some cases sub-zero, and really asked the question, do you have what it takes? And it evened everybody out to a degree that was, you don't really find that the purity of those types of things very many other places, right?
Right.
And so coming out of that, we started with, I think, 160 odd people in our class and graduated 38. And I think coming out of Hell Week, we were at 40. You lose most people in that first 5 weeks, to include Hell Week. That's when you get the most people quitting. So coming out of that, you realize, man, I have gone through something that very few people can go through. And you come out of it with what I would define as true confidence. And true confidence I would define as just a recognition and an understanding that no matter how much an environment devolves, I will figure it out. I'll be okay and I'll figure it out. I'll work through it. It might suck and it might be painful, right?
Right.
But I'll still figure it out. And that type of confidence is key, and probably the biggest thing that I came out of that training with. And then of course have kept, and you need that as a SEAL in your career,
Right.
but of course have kept as I've moved on.
So I think too, I mean, so much of that is mental. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to talk to anybody in your class that didn't continue. Have you followed up with any of those people and see about the psychological side of them, and what was it that kind of made them say, I'm out? Right. I know you
Yeah.
said in the cafeteria, they say, well, that's the most time that you're most susceptible to leave, because you're warm and you get your clothes and you get your clothes on, you get your food, right. And they're trying to talk
Yeah.
you into it. So what did you learn from those folks, maybe that did quit?
Yeah, so of course, I talked to a couple people from my class, but certainly the community does a great job of trying to talk to people as they exit the program, to kind of
Okay.
drum some of that out as well, just to see if they can get data. Ultimately, however, it's a very subjective decision by everybody.
Sure.
However, I will give you some things that we theorize, and one of the things I'll theorize is just it's an inability to compartmentalize effectively. Okay, so this is why, for example, the Chow Hall is a classic place for people kind of decide to quit, and it's because if there's a saying when you start Hell Week. So for your listeners, you start Hell Week on a Sunday afternoon. They break you out in grandiose fashion, yelling, screaming, machine gun blanks, grenade simulators, all that. It's a chaos. It's basically chaos. And you break out Sunday afternoon, and you go from Sunday afternoon till Friday afternoon is when they finish Hell Week. And during that time frame, you sleep maybe 2 or 3 hours for the entire week. Other than that, you're just doing insane exercise stuff. You're just doing ridiculous stuff. It's just grueling. There's a saying though that if you think about Friday on Monday, you're going to quit, right? Because this idea that you're trying to eat the whole elephant, right? You're not able
Yeah.
to effectively focus on very small chunks. And I think what happens to some guys is that, for example, they get in the chow hall and they begin to, in the chow hall, focus on what's coming next. When you're warm in the chow hall, the last thing you want to focus on is how cold it's going to be in the next 30 minutes when you're done eating, right? I remember
Right.
being in the chow hall and the only thing I was focused on was my food. I was like, this food is good.
Nurse to
I don't
body.
care. I'm not even going to think about what's next. I'm just going to think about this food. And then of course, what's next, when they move you on, you move on. And so I think the ability to kind of chunk moments and an environment into what's productive to focus on in the moment is a quality that every guy needs to get through SEAL training. But ironically, and kind of, this whole thing is kind of laced with an unconscious genius. It's also extraordinarily valuable in combat too, because in combat, you have to prioritize massively, and you have to basically effectively think about what you need to think about in the moment, because if you think about too many other things, you're going to get distracted. So I think it trains you to do that in the most extreme environments.
So talk to us about this, our culture, right? It's so important. I am a co-founder and CEO, as I said earlier, of a visionary wealth advisors, an investment firm. And so but we have offices, 7 locations. And I'm just speaking that because that's what we do. But other people, you have your own culture, right? Inside of your company. But yet during this COVID time, we've all been away from each other. And so what are you learning from people you're talking to? Maybe what are you training people on? How do we keep that culture even though we're not together right now?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great problem. And I think the benefit is we're learning a lot, right? Because we're in an environment we've never experienced. I think one of the things I'm finding that I'm hearing people say is that the culture is what it is. And it becomes very apparent when you start getting into these environments of challenge and uncertainty, such as COVID. When you start, kind of fracturing, suddenly you're all working virtually. Well, the culture starts to show up. You see how people behave, and the behavior of the culture starts to show through the Zoom screens and things like that. So that's one. Every business owner that's had to shift like this can actually do a little bit of an autopsy on how their culture was by examining how the culture has either survived or failed, or even thrived in this environment. So that's one. The other thing is, I think it's teaching us the value of human interaction and communication. Obviously, the human interaction connection is that, I mean, that's biological. We need that face-to-face contact. Human beings are social creatures. So
Right.
so the lack of that is going to wear and tear on us all, no matter what. But it takes a more proactive approach when it's across the computer screen, in terms of showing people that you actually care for them in a culture. If it's a culture of caring and trust, the companies who kind of continually establish that, and did so prior to COVID, find themselves doing more of this over Zoom. Spending time. A buddy of mine likes to say, time is the currency of leadership. And it's
Mm.
true, because time is everybody has the same. It's an equal commodity. No one has more time than any other person, right? And once you spend it, it's gone. And so when you choose to spend time with another human being, especially those in your span of care, in a business or a team, that shows them that you care about them. That shows them that you care about them in a way that's fairly quantifiable, because you're
Right.
spending time, and you can do that virtually as well as you can face to face. So that's another important factor I think all of us have to remember. Leadership and care can be expressed across a computer screen. It just takes effort and deliberacy and intent.
Yeah, I love that. Time is the currency of leadership. We talk about that a lot too. Is that you can't replace FaceTime, and I don't mean
Right.
the app on the iPhone, right? But that
Yeah.
mano a mano. But to your point of just doing this, I was
Yeah.
with one of our guys in our Overland Park, Kansas office last week, going over some stuff, and we did a Zoom call, and it was nice seeing him. Right, we can see and talk and
Yeah.
communicate, and I think that's very powerful. So I appreciate that insight. So I saw something when I was doing my research on you. You talked about anxiety plus uncertainty equals fear.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
loved that. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, fear. I think fear is fascinating, and so since retiring, I met a buddy of mine. He's a Stanford neuroscientist out in Northern California. Name is Dr. Andrew Huberman, and he and I gelled on
Right
this.
here,
Yeah,
made for.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he and I gelled on this concept because he actually he has a lab there where he studies fear, and so we began to really talk about fear and what it is and what makes it up. And fear is certainly a physiological response, but it starts in the brain. That's where fear starts. And so it's basically it's an inability to process the environment. So when you talk about the two elements that make up fear, it's anxiety plus uncertainty. Okay, if you have one or the other, you don't necessarily have fear, right? You can have anxiety without uncertainty. So that might be someone who's nervous about giving the presentation at work next week, right? Knows exactly when it's going to be given, knows exactly what to do, has the presentation ready to go, but is just a little bit anxious about it. Okay, there's no fear there; it's just some anxiety. You can be uncertain without being anxious. Okay, that's basically every kid on Christmas Eve. All right, so that's not fear either. When you start to combine the two, however, that's when the fear response starts to kick in. That's when our amygdala and our autonomic system starts to kind of boil and bubble. And we start to be faced with two choices, and we've all heard actually three choices. We've heard fight, flight, or flee. No, excuse me, fight, flight, or freeze, right? Freeze is actually, fight is to deliberately step into the fear. It's not necessarily put your dukes up, right? It's I'm stepping into my fear. Flee is obviously is step away, retreat from the fear, and then freeze. They've found neurologically is simply a pause. It's an oscillation where one is trying to decide which way to go, fight or flight. Um, the interesting thing is when you choose either direction, a different circuit in the brain fires off. Okay. And the cool thing about when you choose the fight response, when you choose to deliberately step into your fear, you get a dopamine reward by doing so. And that's really what Huberman kind of nicknamed the courage circuit, right? That switch is flipped and you get a dopamine reward. It says, hey, this is good, keep going. This is by evolutionary design. We were designed as human beings, as explorers, discoverers, to go out and find stuff, right? It's what's caused us to go from cave dwellers to space explorers in such a relatively short period of time. The neat thing is, while most people assume dopamine happens at the very end of a goal, at the end of an objective or an outcome, that's not the case. It actually happens every step you take. So every forward step you take into your fear, you get that dopamine reward because it's designed by evolution to keep us going, to keep looking for the new shelter, to keep looking for the new food, not to stop at every step. So this encourages us, quite literally, to have courage. And I talk about courage as one of the attributes, but it's one of these things that we can actually practice and do, and we can actually feel those responses. Quick note on fear, though, because I know most people are interested. Hey, if I start getting fearful, how do I stop being fearful? Right?
Right.
The quick trick is to control one of those two elements, if not both. Okay. Anxiety is internal. Okay. It's coming from an internal response, right? So it's physiological, which means you can control it with internal physiological things. Breathing helps you shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic. That helps your anxiety. There are some visual tools that you can use, and Huberman talks about some. One common one is this thing called open gaze, which is basically the idea that you're staring out ahead of you, and instead of focusing on something, you're just kind of noticing your peripheries, right? That immediately has been shown to start shifting your physiology into a parasympathetic. So you're kind of coming off that autonomic response.
Yep.
So you can manage anxiety that way internally, or you can try to manage the uncertainty, which uncertainty is now external. That's all the stuff external to us. The way that we always did that in the teams is something we called control your 3-foot world, right? Focus on something that you can control and move towards it, and ignore things that you can't control. We often get caught up in worrying about things that we have no control over, and that is detrimental on all levels. But if you can pick something to focus on and control it, kind of like I just talked about with Hell Week, I'm going to focus on this. I've suddenly taken control of my world and
Yep.
decrease the uncertainty. So there's tricks to how to kind of disable or at least degrade your fear response by taking control of those two aspects.
And I find that to be fascinating as well. I wear a Whoop. I don't know if that's a Whoop you got there on your right hand.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So I got my Whoop on as well, and so, but it's one of those things. Like I find I've historically been a pretty anxious, nervous person. I've learned how to deal with it, how to channel it in the right directions. But I have found more. I think that my body is fighting it more during the day than I even knew, because of the Whoop. Right.
Yeah.
And talking about all the big words you're using and all the stuff, right. Is I find that. And so how do you, and I do the meditation, I do the breathing, I, talk about the gazing off in distance, things similar to that. Like, how do you fix that though? And I know you're not the end all be all answer guy on how to fix fear, or
Yeah.
you know, like the world by now, right? But
well, again, so I'm not sure if you can fix fear. I think what you're doing is you're moving with it, right? And I think that's the best we can do. We are designed to. Fear is not a bad thing. I mean, again, anxiety and fear specifically, but just let's take anxiety and stress. That agitation in our system is by design. When we are hungry, our body begins to feel stressed and agitated. That's a signal to our brain to go find food, right? When we're lonely, our body starts to feel depressed and agitated and stressed. That's a signal for us to go find companionship. This is by evolutionary design. So first thing we can do is reframe what stress actually is. Okay, stress is designed to get us moving and to get us stepping forward. Fear is designed to keep us safe.
Right.
So we can look at the fear and we say, this is by evolutionary design to keep us safe. Now, sometimes in this modern society where there's not a lot of external things trying to kill us, right? We become afraid about things that maybe we shouldn't be afraid of. I mean, it's not like we're going to get chased by bears walking down the street. So maybe, for the single person who wants to start a conversation with that attractive individual they see in the grocery store, well, even though they feel fearful, that might not be the right response. Okay, because again, if you reframe it, it's like, listen, I'm not gonna die doing
It's
this.
true. Yeah.
My survival is not at stake at this. Yeah, sure, I might be embarrassed, but at least I will have tried, right? So reframing is a really great way to begin to work with and inside the fear and anxiety, but also understanding when we start to feel anxious or fearful, understand this is by evolutionary design. Pay attention to it because it could be something we have to think about. One of the best pieces of advice I got as a junior officer, in fact, was a senior officer who told me, "Hey, Rich, always beware the fearless leader because that guy is probably going to get you killed." All right, because if someone doesn't have fear, that's a scary thing.
Right.
you
That's
know,
true. That's a good point.
yeah, you have to be. Fear is designed to allow us to see appropriate risk. It just becomes detrimental if we start reading too much into it. And it stalls us.
So I want to talk about optimal performance versus peak performance in a second, but talk to me about the Whoop that you wear and like what you're learning from that and helping our listeners. They don't have to go out and buy a Whoop tomorrow, but if they do, they can obviously. But and we're not getting paid by Whoop to do this, but we're talking about it.
Yeah.
And so, but what are you learning from that? Like from sleep, water intake. What's the biggest learnings you're taking away?
Yeah, well, admittedly, I just started wearing this, so I'm still
Okay,
learning. I'm going to actually be on the Whoop podcast here soon, so
awesome.
I'm interested. So I want to make sure I wore it and learned about it.
Tell Will Ahmed to come on here, my
Okay,
podcast. He's
I
he's
will.
he's responded through Instagram to me, but I can't get the dang guy to call me or email me back about it. So,
All right, I'll mention it.
all right,
I'm enjoying it because it's showing me things that I typically don't track. I mean, I do like looking at my sleep. I do like
yeah,
looking at the strain and the HRV, and heart rate stuff. I still admittedly need to dive a little bit more into kind of analyzing what
yeah.
it's telling me. I'm only on I think day 3 or 4, so it's still
Oh,
kind of
okay,
collating all
yeah,
this stuff. But I am wearing it, and I'm looking at it when I sleep. One of the things I do like immediately about it is when I wake up and it shows sleep disturbances.
yeah,
It breaks down deep sleep versus REM sleep versus light sleep because again sometimes people don't realize that our sleep is in cycles. So we're
yeah.
constantly doing this. So we're going kind of light sleep, going into REM, into deep, and then coming out again almost every 90 minutes. So to be able to see that and how effective it is making me pay attention more and go to bed a little bit earlier,
Yeah.
which is good.
Maybe not have that one more beer, right?
Well, that's a good point. I've stopped having beer for a while because the pandemic, I was having too many.
That's right.
So,
Exactly.
yeah,
It's funny. I found that through Whoop, my body likes vodka more than beer and wine more than beer.
nice. Yeah,
So yeah, you said
yeah,
you want to have that one drink, at home or something like that. It's now at least knowing what you want to have, and so it's been nice to see that. So, but anyway, we talked about the earlier. I talked about optimal performance versus peak performance, and
yeah.
again, I loved how you talked about that because if I'm climbing and I get to the peak, what's next? Psh,
Right,
I'm
right.
going down, right?
It can only go down. Yeah,
Yeah, and so
yeah.
the optimal living is. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's another thing that Huberman and I gelled on immediately because we were actually ironically at a peak performance kind of conference symposium, kind of something we were doing for some C-suite executives, and we both began to talk and gel on this idea that neither of us were, well, not so much didn't like, but weren't as comfortable with peak as a definition of performance. I got all the time, hey, you SEALs are the most peak performing individuals on the planet. You guys got to be the best at it, right?
Right.
And I would say, no, we're not. Again, peak is an apex from which you can only come down, and peak has to be prepared for, scheduled, planned, and probably trained for and prepared for, right? The pro football player spends his entire week preparing to peak for 3 hours on Sunday. Okay. We can
Mm,
all do this. Okay. If you do have to give that presentation at work next week, you could certainly plan and prepare so that you can peak for that presentation period during that time. I always felt like SEALs, and I think this is life, right? We're more optimal performers. And optimal performance is how can I do the very best I can in the moment, whatever the best might look like. Okay. Sometimes the best looks like peak. It looks like flow states and everything's cool and clicking. Other times it might be like, hey, I'm just taking step by step, head down, step by step. That's all I can do right now.
yeah.
I would often think when we first started talking about this of me in the surf zone freezing my butt off in SEAL training, right?
Right.
There was nothing peak about my performance during that time frame. I was just doing the very best I could, which was not to quit, and not to freeze, right? Combat is like that. Life is like that. I mean, so optimal performance allows for and speaks to this very kind of healthy modulation in our systems where it says, hey, we're not going to you're not going to need to peak all the time. Okay. Sometimes you just need to be steady state. Sometimes you're going to be low. Sometimes you're going to be at peak, right? But if you strive to do the best you can in the moment, that gives you some leeway to appropriately apply peak performance when it's needed, appropriately recover when it's needed, and then appropriately pat yourself on the back when things get really, really crappy, just like they did for all of us in 2020. I would imagine that most people can look back at 2020 and probably not define their performance as peak. Okay,
Right.
very few, most of us were just doing the best we could with this very uncertain, unknown environment, and we were all doing optimal performance.
So when you think about that, the 2020, what did you learn during this whole pandemic, professionally, but personally as well?
Yeah. Well, it was ironic for me because I was writing the book. In fact, I finished the first draft right as we all went into quarantine. And so I was doing edits as we were all kind of quarantined. And I realized, man, this is interesting because the premise of the book stems from this idea that I thought of just based on SEAL training. And one of the examples I give is this idea that in SEAL training in BUDS, you spend hundreds of hours running with boats on your head. You spend hundreds of hours PTing with 300-pound telephone poles on your shoulder and stuff. And you spend hundreds of hours freezing in the surf zone. And then I look at my 21-year career in the SEAL teams, right? And I did hundreds of combat missions, and I did thousands upon thousands of training evolutions. And never on one of those did I carry a boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole on my shoulder, right? So what they were doing to us in SEAL training was not training us to be
Great
Navy
point.
SEALs. All right. It was basically teasing out attributes. It was done to tease out attributes that allowed them to see if we had the attributes it took to be a Navy SEAL. All right. This is what challenge, uncertainty, and stress do, is they tease out these attributes because skills don't really apply in unknown situations, right? So COVID was kind of, for all of us, it was a version of SEAL training. The two big differences for all of us was that none of us volunteered to be there, okay,
Hmm.
like you do at SEAL training, and none of us had the option to quit like you do at SEAL training. So
Right.
so all of us were stuck in this environment where these attributes were being teased out, and whether we were conscious of it or unconscious of it, we learned things about ourselves that we didn't know before because we were thrown into an uncertain environment.
That's incredible. What a great time to bring this book out, huh?
See, yeah, it's a kind of it really was. It felt pretty right.
Yeah.
It was a good, cool
What
time
do
to
you
talk about.
what do you hope that somebody, picks that up today in the bookshelf and they say, I'm gonna read this book. What's the one thing you hope they get from it? I know there's lots of attributes, right? But what's
Yeah.
that one thing for you?
For me, it's this idea that, again, especially in today's environment where unity is so important. Okay, we all have to remember that we're human beings. However, we all come with differences. So in the automobile analogy, we're all cars, but some of us are Jeeps, some of us are Ferraris, some of us are SUVs.
Yep.
Now, there's no judgment, right? Because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. The trick is lifting our hood and figuring out what we are and what our engine looks like. This is where the attributes come in. My hope is that someone will read the book and be able to lift their own hood and figure out where they fall on these attributes, because then they can understand better how they show up and behave, both in regular life and also in certainty. And that'll do two things. First of all, it'll make sure that you kind of, the individual, the reader, can understand, hey, it looks like I'm a Jeep, and it looks like I'm appropriately on a Jeep track. I'm not racing my Jeep on the Ferrari track. Okay, so that's
That's
good.
right.
Or they might say, actually, I'm a Jeep and I'm trying to race on a Ferrari track. I need to change, or vice versa. So that's one. The other thing is that you can develop attributes. You just can't do that. You can't develop them the same way you can develop a skill. An attribute needs to be developed. It has to be self-motivated, self-directed, and it has to take a deliberate, conscious decision to step into challenge, discomfort, and uncertainty. So for example, if someone is impatient and wants to develop patience, that person needs to decide to do it and then deliberately throw themselves into environments that test their patience, that allow them to be patient, to try out being patient. It's going to be tough. It's going to be uncomfortable, but someone can say to themselves, "Hey, I'm coming up low on this one attribute, and I want to have more of it. I'm going to deliberately try to develop that." So I think those are the takeaways I'd like readers to take.
And I think that's good. So let's stay there for a second. So I always say I want to be more patient. I heard early on one time in my professional career, it said, but don't ever pray for patience, because then God's going to put you in places where you got to be patient. My home, my wife, I got four boys. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And in a good way, but I'm always practicing being more patient, but I'm still not very patient.
Yeah.
So how do I
Well,
become
so
better?
I would not, and again, I tried to stay general because I'm not a psychologist on this stuff,
Sure.
right? But here's what I would say in my generalistic view is that I think so there's a progression in when you learn anything, and the progression goes in it's four stages, right? It's unconscious incompetence, i.e.,
Yep.
I don't know how bad I am. It's conscious incompetence, right? I know how bad I am now, then you move to conscious competence, which means I'm getting better, but I have to think about it.
Yep.
And then the fourth is unconscious competence. Now I'm good and I don't have to think about it anymore. All right. My hypothesis is that when developing an attribute, you can likely get yourself up to probably conscious competence. It may be difficult to get yourself into unconscious competence. And the reason is because context matters. You can probably find yourself more easily being patient at home with your kids. Put you on a playground with a bunch of other kids, and you might not have any patience at all. Or the patience
Right.
might be degraded, right? Or put you in traffic, and your patience might be degraded, right? So context and subjectivity matter, especially when it comes to attributes. So I would encourage people, if they want to develop, or if you want to develop your patience, develop it in the context that you want to develop it, and then just understanding that you're not patient will actually help you with your patience, because you can go into an environment and you can start seeing things boil over in a way that's going to test your patience. You're like, okay, the feeling I feel in
Yeah.
myself that's boiling up, that's my impatience, and that alone is a wonderful place to be, because the to be able to take that response from an unconscious act through the conscious frontal lobe thought process is in essence helping you deal with it better.
Awareness is key, right?
Right? Yeah.
So I'm going to say these words here real quick. I want you to define them when you hear me say these words. So when you hear me say grit, what comes to mind?
Grit is a combination of things. It's not just one thing. And again, I talk about the four elements of grit, right? Which are courage, perseverance, adaptability, and resilience. Those four things catalyzed and blended make up grit. And grit is the ability to kind of push through and step through and persevere more short term kind of stuff. If we start going long term, I start talking about drive. It's more of a long
Yep.
term objective thing, but it's the ability to kind of step through and push through challenges, toughness, stress, whatever it is, kind of in those short spurts is how I would define grit.
And an easy find for those listening is go to Rich's Instagram and you can click underneath your bio there and it'll pop up with some different things, hear him on some podcasts, but also you can take the grit assessment, right? So I
Yes.
took that today,
Yeah.
which was awesome. And so I was surprised I was a medium. I thought
Yeah.
I would be higher, right? So walk me through that. So a test of medium, what does that mean?
Well, so medium is pretty good because
Okay.
at least you have some grit. Again, so just a caveat on the assessment, and you can go to the website and take all three, right? Grit, mental acuity, or drive. What we did there is we basically designed a bunch of questions that were apropos to measuring each attribute, but then we burst it out to about 1,000 people worldwide, and then got that data back. And so when you take the assessment, what you're getting is you're getting your level of perseverance or adaptability or whatever
Yep.
based on a comparison to 1,000 other people. Okay, that's the
Okay.
best we can actually do in an assessment, because really, when it comes to attributes, the most accurate assessment of attributes are situational, environmental, and experiential. I could better assess your grit if I put you into a situation that required you to exercise grit. If I threw you into SEAL training down in Coronado, I'd start to see what kind of grit you had. But again, in that context of SEAL training, right? You obviously, as a business owner, have a lot of grit in that context as well, because you're a successful business owner and you're doing that for a while. Medium grit, again, so I would say you should have got four results. So what was your result for courage, perseverance, adaptability, and resilience? You can be a little higher on a couple and a little lower, and that still balances out pretty nice. You can be high on all of them, and that's cool. You can be low on all, and maybe you want to work on, but that would probably, if you were low on all of them, that would probably show up. You'd probably be able to say, okay, I see why. you
Right.
know.
Right.
But I would encourage anybody who takes it to not look at grit holistically as much as look at each attribute individually, because it's more easy to work on each attribute individually than it is to kind of work on grit holistically.
How do you define happiness?
I would define it as human well-being. If you feel as a human like you are well, you have everything's kind of a sense of security, safety, and love. I think for me, that's happiness. My family. When I'm sitting with my family, that's happiness. When I'm with good friends, that's happiness.
Yep.
So that's That's how I would define it.
Yep. So if I were to ask you this question, which I'm going to, I don't know why I said that, but the fear. So you talked about it earlier. We talked about it earlier. I always ask the guests this: how many of the fears you put in your mind, right up here, how many of them actually blew up to the magnitude you put them in your mind to be?
Well, the quick answer is very, very few.
Right.
Very few. I can't remember even in the throes of combat. I can't remember ever feeling fear to the extent that I was paralyzed. And perhaps that was part, obviously I brought attributes to the table, obviously my training and things like that. But fear, again, fear starts in the brain. It's our perception of an environment, and it's our perception of what's uncertain and what's making us anxious and uncertain about an environment. So we can begin to, most of us magnify that quite a bit because we start to presume or assume things about the environment that just aren't true and don't exist. So what's the acronym for fear?
False evidence is appearing real.
There you go. Right.
Yeah.
So that is accurate in the sense that fear is all about human perception and how we perceive things. It's why things that make me afraid might not make you afraid, and things that make you afraid might not make me afraid. Right. Because it's all about how we perceive it. So when we start to understand that we can control that to the extent that we can control our perception of things, and even the way we frame things, we can begin to control fear. I think we all get a better sense of self-control and self-power.
So if I followed you around for the day with a camera, what are some things that I would see that there's no way you're going to miss on a daily basis?
I always say hugging my wife and kids is I'm know you're gonna
That's important.
that's important. That happens multiple times, especially now that I'm home. Really, it's
Right.
really nice. I always try to get outside at least once, even if the weather's bad. I try to get my pulse up, in one way or another. And I'm not talking about anger.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
talking about exercise.
Right.
In one way or the other on a daily basis. And I think I think those are probably I should probably admittedly have a few more kind of,
No miss items.
no miss items, right? I would love to read every day, more if I could. I do
Yeah.
read, but I'd like to read more often. So there's probably a list of stuff I probably want to do better. But I think those three things are probably the top.
Besides your own book, Attributes, what's the if you can't recommend that one, what's the best book you'd recommend?
So I love books that allow a different optic on anything, but especially human behavior. And so one of my favorite books is *Sapiens* by Harari,
Okay.
and where he talks about basically the evolution of the what is it called, a short history of mankind.
Okay.
Yeah, something like that. Anyway, he talks about the evolution of humans as a species from optics that are just incredible. So I love those types of ideas. I love Nassim Taleb's work. He wrote *Anti-Fragile*. He wrote *The Black Swan*. I love his work. I love, here's what I don't read enough, and I would encourage people to. I don't read enough fiction. I find myself, in fact, I would say, asked me several years ago, I was probably a little bit snobby about it. I was like, well, I don't have time for fiction. It
Right.
doesn't teach me anything. But what I've realized is that fiction actually, as long as it's not overused. I mean, some people use fiction like they use television, right? It's just to
Yeah.
escape. But fiction, when used appropriately, actually it sparks creativity, in a way that nonfiction doesn't. So I need to read more fiction. That's one of the goals I have, is to read more fiction as I progress. Because I used to read, fiction all the time when I was a
Right.
kid. I just have to get back into it.
But you got a lot of books back there, so I'm sure there's a choice.
I guarantee you, I've read the jacket of every one of those books.
Exactly. It's funny you say that. I got so tired of being the guy that had, like, to your point, I got bookshelves at home that I haven't even read the books. And so all these books back here that you can't even see that are off camera, I've
Yeah.
read every single one of these.
Oh,
And
nice.
in April of 2016, I said, I'm tired of being that guy. Right. So I said 10 pages a day. And that 10 pages a day it blossoms into, 20 to 25 books a year
Yeah.
on human performance. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I always say, if Rich reads 50 books in the next 2 years and I read 0, who's got a better shot at winning?
I totally agree. And so I'm gonna take that advice, by the way. I'm gonna commit to myself to try to do 10 pages a day. But I agree. I think every single successful person I've ever encontered, the one commonality is they read.
That's right.
So
I
yeah,
just gave a
reading.
talk a few weeks ago and I was doing some research for it. I think it was Henry Ford said, I'm sorry, not all readers lead, but all leaders read.
Yes.
And I thought that was powerful. And I did this in May of 19. I just said, 10 pages a day, that's 20 books a year, right? It's 3,650 pages. Fast forward 5 years, that's 18,250 pages and about 100 books just in
Yeah.
5 years.
Right.
you
Yeah.
know? So anyway, I kind of beat that drum a lot on this podcast. And if I speak anywhere, that's what I'm talking about. But it's knowledge is power. And there's so much, clarity I get from reading. And I think it's
Yeah.
really, really powerful. So,
I agree. I agree.
so if I steal your cell phone from you, I take this thing and I can't delete I won't delete your pictures or your email or calendar or something like that. But is there anything on your phone there that you just right now for you, for business, for life that you got to have that's really powerful for you?
Probably my podcast app. I love listening to podcasts. That's
Yeah.
one thing I do. I try to do more frequently is just listen where I can't read any kind of net time that I have, whether
Yeah.
it's driving or flying or whatever. I try to listen to podcasts. Like I don't do it in the gym when I'm working out. I listen to music because I do believe in escapism to a certain degree. I think there needs to
Yep.
be a balance because even just escaping to some music allows my brain to start spinning on things that
Yep.
otherwise it wouldn't if I'm listening to someone. But yeah, other than that, I try to stay off the phone other than using it as a practical utility
Working
tool,
device.
working device. I try to stay off of it as an entertainment device because again, I found for me again, this is for me, I found that I have to limit the amount of escapism I engage in because it wastes a lot of my time, and
Yep.
and sometimes even escaping to my phone, whether it's a game or something, doesn't even allow me to get to escape inside my head. And I think it's important. I think most people deny themselves the opportunity of escaping into their head once in a while just to process ideas and think. I remember when I was a kid, again, we're probably roughly the same age. We grew up and there weren't really any Walkmans or video games or
Right.
even cell phones. And my dad, we used to go on family trips and we drive in the car, right? So these are 18, 20-hour drives. And I'd stay in the back, I'd be in the back seat and I'd stare out the window for 18 hours. I'd be staring at the window
Yeah.
and I'd just think and I'd visualize and I'd dream and
Yep.
and to this day I can sit on an airplane and I don't need anything. I can just look out the window. I usually need a window seat, but but I can look
Yeah.
out the window. And what I find that allows me to do is think about things and really come up with ideas. And so a lot of the ideas I came up with and come up with, and even a lot of the stuff in the book, are stuff that I just think about either flying on an airplane or when I go jogging. I run, and nowadays I don't run for any type of competitiveness whatsoever. In fact, the philosophy on my runs is I start out slow and I finish eventually. Um, but
That's
running
good.
for me is therapeutic, and running for
Right.
me is a great thinking time, and so I think while I run. So all these things are times where people need to, I think I would encourage them to put down their devices and
Yeah.
just be in their head a little bit. And that's even to include podcasts and books, just be in their head and think about things for themselves, ask questions and process and ask themselves, hey, what do I think about this? Or what else can I think about? And it's just a really, I think, important tool that a lot of people deny themselves.
That's great. I worry about that for our children. You think
Yeah.
about when if we went on a 12-hour car ride now, there's no way in heck they're going to look out the window for 12 hours like you and
Yeah.
I did as kids, right?
Right. Yeah. I agree.
So
I
got to
agree.
focus on that. So where do our listeners find more of you? So social media, website, obviously you can get the book at really anywhere.
Yeah, you get the book anywhere. Yes, I'm on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and yeah, theattributes.com. If you go to theattributes.com, you have all the links to all the social media there as well. You can get the book there. You can take the assessment there for free. It's up there for free. And sign up for a newsletter. We're starting to put those out too, so people
Awesome.
can kind of stay involved. And I'm going to be putting up on the site here shortly some workbooks that allow people to a guide basically on how to develop each attribute, because I
Oh,
know
wow.
that's the next question I've been getting is how do I develop perseverance or how do I develop self-efficacy? And
Yeah.
so I've developed some workbooks to help people if they want to develop an attribute, things they can do to kind of deliberately develop each attribute. So that's coming here soon. So all that stuff you can find at theattributes.com. And yeah, appreciate anybody who looks it up.
Absolutely. Well, Rich, thanks for being on the Circuit of Success. It's been great having you.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.